Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtual Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your virtual pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
Hello everyone, this is Fortune's Wheel and I'm your host Jonathan, and today we're starting a new series supporting what's happening on the Public Podcast. This new series is called Context of a Conquest. On the Public Podcast, we're taking a deep dive into the Norman conquest of England, but here on Patreon, we're asking a few questions about it. While the English were undergoing massive cultural, political, religious, and economic transformation, what are Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and other areas directly impacted by Duke William's conquest doing? We know the implications of the conquest. We know they stretch far beyond England eventually, and we want to try to accurately set up these other areas with the context needed to fully grasp what occurred across the Isles in the late 11th and well into the 12th centuries. I want to sincerely thank all of you who are listening to this, as you have generously donated to the production of this podcast and shown that you believe in what's happening here. There are no words for my appreciation, so I'll simply offer another heartfelt thank you. So, back to our second members-only series. This is episode 8, entitled Ireland After Clontarf. I hope you enjoy the show. Palm Sunday, 1014. Just a few miles northwest of Dublin, the sun rising over the eastern waves of the Irish Sea and to the purple-skied west, rolling hills and patches of forest hid a dangerous threat to the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru. This is Clontarf, a place that holds a special spot in the story of the Irish people. Approaching 80 years old, Brian Boru, the man who single-handedly broke the ancient line of High Kings, only being from the mighty Uí clans, insisted he take the field and command his forces against his largest threat to his rule yet. Various Norse and Irish forces stood in Brian's way for complete domination of the island, ports and all. Seamus McManus, author of The Story of the Irish Race, wrote, quote, "A great host of the massed forces of the Norselands assembled on the shore of Clontarf. It consisted of 1,000 mail-clad Norsemen under Brodar, Vikings from Normandy, Flanders, England, and Cornwall, and above all, fierce fighting men from the Orkneys, Shetlands, Hebrides, and other islands off the west coast of Scotland, all picked men, and most conspicuous for valor of the men of their time. With them also were the men of their race who had settled in and around Dublin, and the Uí Kinsellas from Wexford, and the men of Leinster." End quote. Now, if you'd like more information about why such a vast host of belligerents felt the need to unite temporarily under one banner for the sake of taking down one man's rule, I encourage you to head back all the way back, to Episode 5, The Rise of Brian Boru, and Episode 6, Imperator Scotorum, on the Public Podcast. But as it is, that's almost beside the point at this point in our narrative. High King Brian Boru wasn't without his own supporters, though. From his own community of Munster to those of Connacht and Meath, as well as a smattering of Norsemen from Limerick and up the River Shannon, Brian was sitting okay himself. Given his advanced age, his highest-ranking men insisted he sit this one out. Brian's son, Mercad, was more than capable, as McMahon calls him, quote-unquote, a captain of outstanding ability. The Battle of Clontarf was set, and it would define Ireland's next several decades. Just days later, on Thursday, April 22nd, word came from Brian's camp that Brian Boru refused to enter the battlefield on Good Friday, a holy day to the Christian warriors under Brian's command. Religion certainly plays a role in the Battle of Clontarf for sure, because across the battlefield were thousands of pagans who, that night, would receive a message from their chief god Woden, who, as McManus says, quote, rode up through the dusk on a dapple-gray horse, halberd in hand, to take counsel with his champions, end quote. Now, Woden commanded them to attack Brian at daybreak the next morning, that is, Good Friday, April 23rd, 1014, catching the old king unawares and unprepared. From sunup to sundown that Friday, battle raged. Hundreds, if not thousands, fell that day. It was a bloody, brutal affair, worthy of epics. The story of the Battle of Clontarf included Christians versus pagans. It included the intervention of gods. And it even included nature itself playing its part when, at sunrise, boats were placed for a hasty retreat for the pagans. But by the time they needed them, sometime approaching sunset, the tides had taken the boats much further away, forcing the fleeing Norsemen to turn and fight to the death. Now, the Irish, that is, Brian Boru's forces, as they were referred to, were victorious that day, which was a significant achievement for an island, more or less, subjugated by the influence of Norse Vikings for 2 centuries already, but, McManus writes, quote, it was a costly victory for the Irish. The king himself, the heir apparent, his brave son Mercad, and the heir apparent's heir, Turlo, all fell in the battle. End quote. Yeah. Despite defeating the Viking army, Ireland lost its most powerful leadership in centuries that day. After Brian Boru was murdered in his tent while he prayed, so the stories go, the bodies of his son and his grandson were found. It was a devastating blow, and the celebrations were muffled that night for sure. Within days, Brian's once formidable coalition disbanded, and they walked home. McManus writes of Brian Boru, quote, the days of Ireland's glory were departed. In the words of his eulogist, Brian was the last man in Erin who was a match for 100. He was the last man who killed 100 in one day. His was the last step that true valor ever took in Erin. He was a sovereign of whom any nation might justly be proud, and one of the world's greatest monarchs. Had he or his family lived, the chance is that the prestige of his name and the great victory at Clontarf, they would have founded a hereditary monarchy which would have put an end to disunion and demoralization and provided one of the strongest bulwarks against the Norman invasion which was soon to fall upon the country. End quote. Ah, and there it is. I'm sure there was a question being asked in your heads about what Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf in the year 1014 had to do with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Well, as promised, there is a connection. I'll read it again. McManus writes, quote, "Had he or his family lived, the chance is that with the prestige of his name and the great victory at Clontarf, they would have founded an hereditary monarchy which would have put an end to disunion and demoralization, and provided one of the strongest bulwarks against the Norman invasion, which was soon to fall upon the country." End quote. Though, again, the Battle of Clontarf was ultimately as decisive a battle as they come. Quite the opposite of the Battle of Hastings, to be sure. Its significance as a watershed moment in which the Viking Age in Ireland had functionally ceased to be. Make no mistake, Norse and Danes still lived there in large numbers, even after the battle. But, as McManus says, these Scandinavians quickly became as Irish as the Irish themselves. Within just a couple generations, if you visited Ireland, you would find it very difficult to distinguish the Viking from the Irishman. And despite Brian's son, who was out collecting supplies for an extended stay at Clontarf, thus missing the battle itself to no fault of his own, again, no one had any idea that the battle would actually be fought the day it was. Doncad, taking control of his father's realm, disintegration did in fact happen around the island. See, Doncad declared his intention to earn the High Kingship like his father, but it quickly became apparent that he just didn't have the same sway as Brian. Mael Seshnel of the Uinil became High King again. And to boot, Doncad had to contend with his other brother, Tad, as well as other contenders for the crown of Munster, though Doncad would prevail there. See, what you have to ask is, what changed in Ireland for Clontarf to have had such an impact, to be considered one of the great decisive battles of the Middle Ages? And to be sure, it is, or at least should be considered so. Brian Boru died, and his son Doncad became King of Munster. Brian's old antagonist, Mael Seshnel of the Uinil, became High King of Ireland, again, a position he more or less had in all but name before Brian came along. And the Danish Viking warlord Sigtrygg stayed in his position of leader of Dublin. That's just it, though. Nothing may have changed on the surface, except a change in the position of High King, but the disunity became a crippling hindrance moving forward. The next several years of disunification would set the stage for a bell to toll the waning opportunities Ireland had to establish itself independently. The time was ticking, but no one seemed to hear it, so petty skirmishes between minor lords further weakened the island up until and well past the time of William the Conqueror in England. But moving on from the large and powerful Viking presence on the island was a significant step. McManus writes, quote, "The Viking Age was by no means a starless night in Ireland, nor was society so horribly disorganized as is generally believed. It was a period marked by the lives of Irish chiefs of outstanding ability, of some of the greatest figures in Nordic history, and of women of unusual personality. Though internecine feuds and battles with the Danes took up much of the chieftain's time, other things besides spears and swords were exchanged between the Irish and the invader. In no other land in which these two people of such different cultures came together did each learn so much from the other as in Ireland." End quote.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Lowe's knows when you're looking for reliability, the right brand makes all the difference. And now, Lowe's is the exclusive home improvement retailer for the Whirlpool water treatment line, including their Wi-Fi softener, under-sink filtration system, and more. With Whirlpool's proven performance and our everyday low prices, better tasting, better quality water is within reach. Shop pro-trusted brands like Whirlpool and more, in-store or online. Lowe's, we help, you save.
Now that is a pretty glowing review of an otherwise dismal narrative, but I think it speaks volumes of what went into making modern Ireland. Where one was strong, like the Irish were with farming and livestock, for instance, the other was weak, and the same goes in reverse. By the death of Brian Boru, Ireland had become a hub of activity. It was bustling, from the highly lucrative slave trade to the home of some of the hardiest ships built around Europe. During the Viking Age in Ireland, coins were minted for the first time. Silks made their way from as far away as the Silk Road, and Irish missionaries were disseminated around Europe and were very, I can't understate this at all, they were very influential in the development of Catholic theology throughout the Middle Ages. By no means was it always civil, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Icelandic skalds entertained along Irish bards, each telling tales of their homelands and their people, though everyone in attendance were culturally intertwined enough to follow along with the other. Ironworking became an exceptional Irish talent during those centuries, as well as poetry, from which the poetic style called the limerick became fashionable. With Brian Boru out of the way, the veterans of the Battle of Clontarf back home and settled in, and Mael Shushnell MacDonald of the Uineal back in the seat of High King of Ireland, one would think things would begin to reform into something resembling a unified land. But many people over the next several decades didn't see Mael Shushnell's return to power as a restoration of Irish hegemony, a return to the good old days, you could say. Rather, they saw Brian Boru's playbook and began to use it as a means to become High King themselves. Since time immemorial, the Uineal had been the beating heart of Irish politics and power, but Brian Boru had upended that indomitable reign. So when Mael Shushnell regained the title, it showed that maybe the Uineal weren't all they were cracked up to be. Taking a quick 30,000-foot view of Ireland could prove beneficial here to give us an idea of how fractured Ireland became as of 1014. In the north, you had the powerful northern Uineal, the Ulidia, the Oriel, and the Breffni kingdoms. Across the middle of the island, from west to east, the Connaught held wide swathes of land, which was right next door to another huge chunk of land held by the also very powerful southern Uineal, of which Mael Shushnell MacDonald was king of, and which was also known as the Kingdom of Meath. In the largest kingdom on the island, in terms of territory anyway, in the southwest of the island was Brian Boru's own Munster, and Leinster rounds out the major kingdoms in the southeast. Now, pockmarked along the coast were a number of Viking port settlements, very, very powerful, very influential. The largest and most influential of these were Limerick at the mouth of the River Shannon, Cork, and Waterford, which were all three in Munster. There was Wexford, which was in Leinster, and finally the largest and most influential of them all was Dublin, which held vast tracts of land between Meath and Leinster. Now, let's remember that Ireland, similar to Scotland, was still run essentially by clans of varying sizes and levels of wealth and influence. Breaking each of these kingdoms down, you find large clans who claimed smaller kingships here and there, but as we say today, follow the money. Or I suppose it would be follow the sheep back then, and you'll see that there were a few kings who garnered certain levels of loyalty and wealth over others, and these are the kings and the kingdoms mentioned. But fractured as it was, as instead of just one king raking in all the tributes, you now had several kings who raked in all the tributes. This, slowly over the next few years, went back to giving these tributes to High King Mael Sheshnel MacDomnall again. But it wasn't nearly as complete a view as you'd think, thus the fracturing I keep harping on about after Clontarf. And the fracturing is further evident in a specific term used to categorize High Kings of Ireland in the years between 1022, when Mael Sheshnel MacDomnall died, to the mid-1050s, or so. You had the Rí Arán, and you had the Rí Arán Co Fhrosarba. Now, truth be told, this second term wasn't used until records written in the 12th century were produced, describing the tumultuous 11th century, but the fact still remains that there was a reason why they felt they needed two different terms for the same position. Further to the point, if you were classified as Rí Arán, that was a simple title of High King of Ireland. So, Brian Boru, he would be Rí Arán, Brian Boru, or Mael Sheshnel MacDomnall would also have the title of Rí Arán. However, if you were given the title of Rí Arán Co Fhrosarba, that was a term translating to High King of Ireland with opposition. That is, if you were Rí Arán Co Fhrosarba, sure, you were an accepted High King, but you weren't the sole claimant of that title. In the records, you may have been listed as the Rí Arán Co Fhrosarba, but there was enough of a presence of opposition to your rule that it wasn't a given. You know, much like Tom Brady having an asterisk next to his title of GOAT due to proof of his coach cheating and some deflated footballs. Oh, I'm kidding, Patriots fans. What would you expect from a hometown Colts fan anyway? Now, seriously, though, as Francis John Burns says in his book Prehistoric and Early Ireland, quote, it could be argued that the High Kings with opposition met with opposition precisely because they tried to become kings of Ireland in a real sense. They were not less successful than their predecessors, but only seemed so. End quote. See, it wasn't just a chaotic mess of shifting wealth and influence in the communities across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East during the 11th century. Ireland was very much included in the tumult of the 11th century, which is strange because this tumult wasn't exactly due to external forces like it was predominantly in England, Poland, Italy, Iberia, West Africa, and the Middle East. The thing to remember about Ireland's unique flavor of 11th century change was that it was written very much by internal upheaval in the vein of Brian Boru and others who wanted to be like him. And while the Vikings were a presence on the island, sure, they were more or less, at that point, 1014, confined to a handful of ports. Not so much inland. But what punctuated the Irish 11th century was that, seemingly on the surface, internal power dynamic shifted. There wasn't much of a net gain for the Irish in the long run. Sure, what Brian Boru did was incredible and showed the tenacity of one charismatic Irishman in the face of a powerful, long-standing, almost ancient power structure. But what the question we should be asking, in the face of an impending Norman invasion, mind you, even if they weren't aware of it, is what did Brian Boru leave to the Irish? Really, what was Brian Boru's real impact on Ireland's future? Well, if you get down to brass tacks here, Brian Boru upset the balance of power enough to inspire others like him to try their hand at it. Say what you want about the traditional ruling elite of the Uaníl, but there was a relative stability the Irish could count on. Maybe not support or agree with or even enjoy, but they could rely on the structure. They knew what to expect, and generations had learned to maneuver in and around it. It was, in its most basic explanation, reliable. And in the realm of human interaction, the very glue that holds communities together is expectation. It's reliability. The Uaníl were the top dogs, but we could expect the structure that brought, for better or for worse. And Brian Boru came along and changed the whole thing. With ambitious potential usurpers lining up in the wings to take their shot at the Uaníl, Ireland's power structure, in essence, the very expectations upon which the last few centuries really were predicated upon, was then upended. It was undermined, even if just in thought. The Uaníl power structure was undermined. After Brian Boru's death in 1014, a return to the Uaníl structure was attempted by the return of Mael Sheshnel MacDomnall of the Southern Uaníl as High King of Ireland. But everyone's thinking about the position had changed by then. Brian Boru's feats had changed everything. See, Brian Boru may not have been the first High King of Ireland, though he's given the title. So, to clear that up, the Uaníls, since time immemorial, as we've said, were considered the island's greatest clan and were given the title of High King. That's where the money flowed. But Brian Boru is remembered and revered even today as Ireland's first High King because, historically, that is, according to the records, he was the first High King who earned the title. As the incomparable comedian Robin Williams once said about a certain U.S. president, some people are born with greatness, some people achieve greatness, and some receive it as a graduation gift. You know, it seems that though the Uaníls were a powerful and capable clan, Brian Boru achieved the title of greatness, as opposed to simply passing it down from one generation to another by default. And when Brian Boru died, he left a lasting impression on the minds of Irishmen everywhere. What says the Uaníl were the only ones capable of harnessing so much power, influence, and wealth? The Irish were left with a nagging, lingering, banshee-like thought. Why not me? And therein lies Brian Boru's real legacy, in my opinion anyway. The collapse of the traditional power structure, the very power structure that held the Norse and Danish Vikings to the coasts and ports, the very power structure that held together the highly venerable schools of learning on the island, the very power structure that held kingdoms within kingdoms in a semi-cooperative state for centuries. The 11th century for Ireland specifically can be defined as a decline in Uaníl power structure, thereby fracturing and weakening the island enough over the decades following the Battle of Clontarf to make it just that much easier pickings for Anglo-Normans in the 12th century. Thank you for listening. Until next time.